Our adventure today takes us to Fort Niagara in New York. Fort Niagara's strategic place in American history seems forgotten. My visit encountered few people along its way, mainly elderly men wearing veteran hats, accompanied by bored wives prodding them to hurry up as they linger by forgotten artifacts, reading every word of the attached plaques and history boards. I myself, a female veteran with an AARP membership, felt thankful to be alone on my historical adventure. Through the well laid out museum and the fort itself, I could take as much time as I wanted with no one begging to go shopping instead. To me, history tells the story of who we are as a people, where we came from, and where we are going. So many stories that will become lost from collective memory if we don't pursue it. The good, the bad, both are important for us to know, to grow as people and change the future for the better. The stories are fascinating in and of themselves. Young people who do not know history, even of their very own family and heritage, are ill prepared for their present and future lives. Understanding nature and history, in my opinion, are imperative to the human experiences of today and tomorrow's world. I am visiting Fort Niagara on a warm, sunny day in early August 2024. The first thing that caught my eye driving into the parking lot is the 1871 lighthouse. It looks like a stone castle with a lighthouse on top. Beautiful, simply gorgeous masonry. It was originally built in 1787. The light was placed on the French castle inside of the fort, and they moved it in 1871 to its current location. What a beautiful little lighthouse. Could you imagine living in such tight quarters? The lighthouse remained in service until 1993 when it was decommissioned by the Coast Guard base located adjacent to the fort. Fort Niagara has been occupied by three nations: the French, the British, and the Americans. It was built in 1678. The French were the first to occupy the area. It was a trading post with the Iroquois Indians. Later, the French castle was built, and it was called the House of Peace. It was for commerce and trade amongst the Indians. It also was a strategic place to control the headwaters to the St. Lawrence River, the Niagara River, which controlled the entrance to Lake Erie, and down into further investigation and exploration of the country. It was in 1759 the British took over, and in 1796 the Americans took over. During the War of 1812, the British held the fort once again for 17 months, where they fortified it and made the fort harder to penetrate. But in 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and the British handed over the fort back to the colonists without any violence. It was a peaceful transition at that time. Since then, during the Civil War, it held Union soldiers that had once been prisoners of war. The active soldiers were still continuing to fight in the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, it remained peaceful, and it was a place of training for the Spanish-American War. It was a training camp, and the soldiers were sent to Cuba and to the Philippines during that time. And then in 1915, it was also a training camp for World War I. So the fort has undergone lots of different changes throughout the years, but it is a fascinating fort with a huge story to tell. As you can see, the museum itself is very well laid out with tons of different artifacts, paintings, and remnants of the past. One of my favorite artifacts are the remnants of the original flag that was captured by the British in the War of 1812. It was sent over to England, where it stayed in a castle and there was a fire. That's not blood you see on the flag, that is the original flag that is that color from having been burnt. And it has been laid down on a mock up of the original flag so that you can see where the pieces of the original would fit in the pattern and how big and glorious that flag was in its originality. I also thoroughly enjoyed all the historical photographs that were taken from the mid 1800s to about the 1930s. They're fascinating to look at, so take your time in the museum, it's well worth it. I used this book that I purchased from the visitor's gift shop um, to do my research. It's called A History and Guide to Old Fort Niagara. It was written by Brian Lee Dunnigan and it was produced by the Old Fort Niagara Association. The book is very well written with great illustrations and very easy to follow. One of the best history books I've read. We are now entering the fort itself. We're coming in past the Dauphin Battery and the South Redoubt. It's a guardhouse that's laced with cannons. During the War of 1812, on December 19th, 1813, a huge amount of fighting took place there before the British were able to conquer the fort. What you're looking at now is the current Coast Guard base. In 1900, it was the U.S. Life Saving Services, where it launched rescue boats. Now it's part of the current Coast Guard. In 1915 is when it became an actual Coast Guard base. We are now approaching the Gate of the Five Nations. It was honoring the Five Nations of the Iroquois. Fascinating building. Wow. Look at that huge pulley system used to open and lower the moat and the doors to the gate. Man, what an awesome door. Look how thick that wood is and how strong the iron bars are on the little window. There's even a nice storage shelf for the extra cannons. Could you imagine being a British soldier walking down that narrow hallway with guns and muskets and cannons going off, and what that must have been like to storm the fort? How frightening to be standing behind that window as the American guard watching the British come pounding through. I can't imagine how awful that would be. Look how the exit to the gate perfectly frames the French castle. Isn't that beautiful? This reminds me so much of the medieval castles that I toured while I was stationed in Germany in the 1980s. Wow, that's just incredibly beautiful. Look at the kegs that held the powder for the cannons. Once you clear the gate, you step out directly into the open area of the grounds where you will see the flags and the courtyard. There are massive earthworks that were done to protect the fort from invasion. In 1934, a lot of the fort had to be refurbished by the old Fort Niagara Association, which was started in the 1930s for the preservation of the history of Fort Niagara. As I said earlier, this fort has been occupied by three different nations: the French, the British, and the Americans. And the three flags represent all three nations that have occupied this fort. This is the North Redoubt building. It is different than the South Redoubt building, being that it is more for storage and a guard tower than a gate. It can house guards. There are bunk beds inside, as well as 3 stories. Up top, you have a magnificent view of Lake Ontario. Well worth the visit to check it out. Also, there happen to be some pet barn swallows up there. Check out these 4-person bunk beds. They don't look very comfy to me. You got those handy dandy coat hooks for when your overcoat is just too heavy and you can't sleep in it. Some itty bitty windows. You got a great view of the courtyard. The floor looks very much like the Roman road. These stairs are a little tricky. Everybody, watch your step. I see cool stuff ahead. Cannons and other stuff. Let's take a look. What a magnificent view from up here. I bet the guards fought over who got to have guard duty just to get that view. That, my friends, is Lake Ontario. Isn't she grand? How on earth did they calibrate those cannons so they could hit the ships that are out at sea? Cannons everywhere up here. There is a ton of them. We got Thelma and Louise up here, little barn swallows that have made their home here in the North Redoubt building. After a few minutes of meditation with this beautiful view, it is now time to go downstairs. Watch your step, guys. It's a doozy. Over 200 years of dirty hands have held onto this rail. Look at the wood, how it's worn where people have put their hands. What is going on out here? Listen to all that noise. They're trying to recruit new soldiers. I enlisted 40 years ago, not doing it again. In 1687, the survivors of the French starvation period were met by Father Millet, a priest for the garrison. He assisted them and helped them, and they created a oak cross in commemoration of their gratefulness for having survived. In 1926, a cast iron cross was created in his honor and placed where it is to this day. It once was a national monument. The Rush Bagot Memorial was created in 1934. Inside is housed remains that were found of unknown soldiers during the excavation of this monument. It was in honor of the Rush-Bagot Agreement, formally ratified as a treaty by the United States on April 28, 1818, and by Great Britain on October 2nd, 1818. In 1726, the French castle was created by the French. It was named the Maison Montecuculi, which meant the House of Peace. The Iroquois were told that it would just be for trade and commerce so that they could bring their furs peacefully and trade for goods. The French, tongue in cheek, really had no intention of just keeping it a house of peace. They intended to fortify this area and to eventually bring in a military presence for safety. To the left of the building is the added on baking house. The original baking house was inside of the castle itself. If you enter the castle through the far right door, you'll be stepping down a few steps into the merchant area where there is a bark canoe hanging and all kinds of trade goods, just as it would have been back in the day. This was a place where people gathered together, had a few drinks, hung out, exchanged furs for trade goods, etc., etc. The shopkeeper never had to worry about being late for work because his bed was right there in the market. So he could just lay down and wake up and go right back to work. Yep, there's my silly mug. Um, if you look around the room with me, you can see there's a well right in the middle of the room. That well is very strategic. It is a clean water
This
source
is
that
inside
they
the
had
castle.
access to even during a siege. You see that long bunk bed? All the soldiers would lay there single file and toss and turn and keep each other awake, steal the covers. There's hooks for their trousers and their uniforms and their boots. They had a fireplace right there in the rooms. The first floor is mainly different barracks rooms and storage rooms. And the second floor is the officers' quarters and the different offices and more storage rooms. Almost every room has an ornate fireplace with the King George coat of arms on it. This room is for the low ranking officers on the second floor. They at least get to have their own bunk. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you the blacksmith shop where all that ornate hardware probably was made. Isn't that a gorgeous door? It makes me think of Pirates of the Caribbean. Well, this is the room where the powder kegs are stored. That's keeping your powder dry. There are rooms like it that also served as jail cells on this floor. This is the officers' mess, chow hall, whatever you want to call it. That's a plaque commemorating this is a true bona fide military kitchen from the 17 to 1800s. Saw this nice young lady when I exited the castle. It was a very, very hot day, and I asked her if she was sweating to death in all those clothes. And she told me that the clothes actually keep her cool, and that's why the colonists wore so many clothes. That the only thing that felt hot was her face and her hands that were exposed to the sun. Can you imagine that? She said her inner garment was made out of wool and cotton. Wow. Who would have thought that would keep you cool? I would have thought she'd be sweating bullets. And here we have another young lady from the late 1700s boiling laundry for the troops. And here's the blacksmith shop with all the different tools and hammers and metal ready for heating up and pounding and bending into something useful. I'm sure the blacksmith guy was the hottest man in the whole camp. One last swing around the courtyard so that you can see all the buildings before I leave. My visit here has come to its conclusion. You can see the trading post, which is actually a restaurant snack shop where you can get cold drinks and hamburgers and hot dogs and ice cream. So, y'all have a great day. Come visit this fort and learn a little history. It's pretty darn interesting. And please don't forget to make your way to the gift shop and purchase this little book that gave me so much information in a concise manner. It's called A History and Guide to Old Fort Niagara, written by Brian Lee Dunnigan, and it is sponsored by the Old Fort Niagara Association. Thank you guys and have a great day. I appreciated you coming along with me.